Again, here we are on the second day of our walking tour. I'm here with Mary Ann. My name's Phil Wiry. I'm with Morgan County Historical Society, and we're here at Stop 7, St. McGee's. If you remember Stop 6 we were at the Rhodes Ferry, or the Lafayette Street Cemetery, that was the graveyard of the family of Dr. Henry Rhodes. This is the location of where Dr. Henry Rhodes' home stood. It was a two-story colonial. If you picked up one of the pamphlets that we had down at the cemetery, you can actually see a picture of the home that we have here that was located here. It was here until 1864 when the Union soldiers came and tore the home down. After Dr. Henry Rhodes left here, this location, he went to Blount County, and then you had people like Dr. Solomon Sykes. We hadn't talked much about the Sykes family, but Dr. Henry Rhodes' family, Colonel Francis Dancy, James Turner Sykes, all three of those families came from Raleigh, North Carolina, and all were intermarried and interrelated. One of the ladies that's buried in the cemetery is Evelina Rhodes. That was the daughter of Dr. Henry Rhodes. She married John Winfield Scott Dancy, who was actually her first cousin. Back in those days, there was a lot of cousins marrying cousins, and he was the nephew of someone we talked about earlier, Dr. Francis Dancy, or Colonel Francis Dancy at the Dancy Folk House. But he went on to Texas after she died. He became the father of the Texas Railroads. He fought with General Sam Houston during the Texas Revolutionary War, and he would come back to Decatur from time to time and sit in the cemetery down here where he would pine away thinking about Evelina and the time that he spent here in Decatur. The last person to be born here in the Dr. Henry Rhodes home was the daughter of Methodist minister Finch Scruggs. That's who I like to refer to as the other Miss Kate. That was Kate Scruggs. She was born here. She married her husband in Memphis, a guy named Carl Goodtears, who was a famous artist in Memphis. They left here to Decatur, lived in Paris for a while, then Washington, D.C. If you go to Washington, D.C., go by the Library of Congress, go in the Congressional Reading Room, and if you look up at the Congressional Reading Room ceiling, all those panels were painted by Carl Goodtears, or the husband of Miss Kate Scruggs that was born here in this house, the last one to be born. The other Miss Kate that most people talk about has to do with St. McGee. We're here by St. McGee's. St. McGee's was one of our two most famous steamboat captains that we had. The other was a guy named George Washington Harris. We'll talk about his wife a little bit later when we get down to the Carnegie. But he was one of our most famous authors. He wrote the Soot Lovingood stories. But after he wrote those, he moved here to Decatur, married a young widow, and lived the rest of his life here in Decatur. What most people don't know about St. McGee is his name wasn't really St. McGee. It was William Simpson McKee, M-C-K-E-E. And he was walking along Bank Street here one day and ran into a lady named Kate Lackner. Kate Lackner was married. She had met her husband in Hannibal, Missouri. They had moved to Decatur, and Robert Lackner Sr. had gone through and started a jewelry store here in Decatur. So they had a son, Robert Lackner Jr. She was walking along Bank Street here, met St. McGee, fell madly in love, went home, packed a little black bag, and moved in with him at his home that was at the end of Bank Street here. And there is where she set up her brothel, and so she became one of our most notorious ladies that we had here. In fact, if you remember the movie Paper Moon with Tatum O'Neal and Ryan O'Neal, her house or her brothel was featured in that movie. But she would outlive St. McGee. She's actually buried out in Decatur City Cemetery. The owners of that cemetery like to say that she is probably the most frequented spot that people like to go and see where she's buried. She's actually buried next to her sister. A lot of people don't know about Nellie, her sister. that right across the street here at the St. George Cafe, Nellie had a bootlegging business and also a gambling business. So I like to say of the seven deadly sins, you know, Miss Kate and Nellie had at least three of those. But this is our next stop we're going to have is down at the old Weicher's hardware store, just a few stores down. Here we are on Bank Street in front of what was the John D. Weicher hardware store. John D. Weicher was a pharmacist from Ohio that came here after the Civil War, and I guess it's every pharmacist's dream to have a hardware store, but that's what he did when he got down here, was set up a hardware store. And he sold a lot of different items here at the hardware store. Some of y'all may remember it as a toy store later, but one of the things that he sold at his store was dynamite. And back in those days, you'd go to the hardware store in the 1930s and get dynamite. Well, you didn't want to store dynamite here on Bank Street, so he had a bunker down at the Decatur City Cemetery where he kept his dynamite. And I guess that was a good place. You know, if the dynamite went off there, all those people are already dead, so it wouldn't have affected them. But in the 1930s, something happened down there at the bunker, and all his dynamite exploded. And when it did, it knocked out half the windows between here and the city cemetery. So in the 1930s, he was going through and replacing a good bit of the windows between here and the cemetery. We talked about our Jewish families that we had here in Decatur. On the second floor of the hardware store was actually one of our first synagogues that we had here. There was not an official synagogue building, but there was a couple of locations here on Bank Street where the Jewish families, and we talked about half of the Jewish businesses here on Bank Street were Jewish, is where they would come and worship on Saturday. Our next location is going to be the Nungester Drugstore, which is just another few stores down. We're here at the Glee Interior Building, which originally was the Nungester Drugstore. There was a couple brothers, Nungester brothers, that came here from Ohio and were pharmacists and set up a drugstore here. One of the places we're going to go to a little bit later is where Cliff Nungester and his wife and his two daughters had their home on Church Street. Cliff was kind of an interesting feller. He was a member of the school board here in Decatur. He quoted a lot from the Quran. They were members of the Methodist Church, and two of his daughters are two of my favorite I like to talk about. One of them is Frances Nungester. If you're familiar with the Frances Nungester Elementary School, that was his daughter. One of the things Frances was known for is she actually died of ulcers, and people asked her where she got her ulcers from, and she simply would say integration. She was in charge of integrating all the elementary schools back in the 1960s and 70s, which was a stressful time for her, and that's what she would end up passing away. Her most famous sister, though, was Mildred Nungester, who was, I like to say, we talked about Carl Gunter's or Good Tears, that was a famous artist. Mildred also was a famous artist, and we'll talk about her paintings and the work that she did. Mildred actually had an art studio on the second floor here of the Glee Interiors, and I was in Washington not too long ago and went by the National Portrait Gallery and saw one of her paintings that she has in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. So we'll talk a little bit more about that painting when we get down to her house. Bank Street in front of Perceptive Designs. It's the business of Shirley Hammond. I want to give Shirley a shout out. She was one of the original members of the Morgan County Historical Society. Has been kept it going for these many years. She's done a great job of remodeling this building. It used to be a barbershop, one of our black barbershops that we had here on Bank Street. We talked to Miss Kate about Miss Kate and her girls, and this is one of the barbershops that they would use. They would come down here in their cars and load out and come in here to get their hair done. Not in the front. They would send them to the back because it was a respectable barbershop, and so the girls had to go to the back to get their hair done. But next door to it is also the old Roxy Theater. One of the great pictures we have is back in the 1940s when Gone with the Wind came out. And You have people that were lined up all out into the street out here waiting to see Gone with the Wind here at the Roxy. And the Roxy was one of, had about 3 or 4 different at one time or another movie theaters here along Bank Street, but Roxy was probably the most famous of the ones we had. I don't have many ghost stories when we go on the walking tours, but this is the only one that I do have. We're here in front of Jamie Hood Jewelers and also Sykes Place. This building here, you know, we talked about Samuel Sinclair Broadus. This was actually the first location of his bank that he had here on Bank Street, and then it was a number of different businesses afterwards. But back in the 1930s, there was a little girl that was playing here in front of, we call this building the Scott Block. John Fletcher Scott came here from Wisconsin. He built this building and also the one Scott building across the street. But the little girl was playing up on the third floor, got up on the ceiling, and it's not there anymore, but there was a skylight. And she was playing above the skylight, fell through the skylight, and ended up dying here in the lobby of Jimmy Smith Jamie Hood Jewelers. And from time to time, people still see her up on the third floor, playing up there and making noise and doing whatever little girl ghosts like to do. I'm not sure, but that's the, we still have sightings from them from time to time here at this building. Here we're at the parking lot of First United Methodist Church. This was the location of one of our earliest industries that we had here in Decatur. We talked about Dr. Henry Rhodes, and Dr. Henry Rhodes' plantation and his land holdings he had went from Lafayette Street further south, so all this was his property. And this was the first location of one of our industries. It was a hemp factory. And there's actually 2 types of hemp. There's a shorter version that college students like to make those funny little cigarettes with, but there's a taller version that grows to about 10 foot tall, and with it they make rope. So across the river, Dr. Henry Rhodes had a number of hemp fields that he had there, and he would bring the hemp, harvest it, bring it here, and then they would make rope, and then the plantation owners would use that for baling their cotton and other uses. It was also one of the first businesses we had here in Decatur that went out of business. So it was here from the 1920s to the 1930s. Many of y'all probably remember this location as where the Lafayette Street School was. It was the first major school that we had here from kindergarten all the way up to high school. It was here for a number of years, up until about the 1950s. It became an elementary school when they built Riverside High School across Pond Street in its location just a few blocks away. We're here at First United Methodist Church. It's stop 9 on our list of stops that we have. This is actually the second and third location of the Methodist Church here in Decatur. If you remember from one of our earlier stops, we talked about where the first Methodist Church was built inside the city cemetery. Well, after the war, that cemetery was pretty much destroyed. The church was destroyed, and so they built a second wood frame church at this location here. The person that raised the money from it was a man named John Harmon Nichols. He was one of our authors too. He wrote a book called Proof of the Pudding, where he talks about his life and growing up here in Decatur and marrying one of the Banks daughters, Mary Ann Banks. We talked about her, that she was buried over in the Dr. Henry Rhodes Family Cemetery. He went through for a number of months, traveling all over Alabama and Tennessee, collecting money to build the church. He actually had to start over again when he was up in Tennessee and got robbed, lost all the money they'd raised, but he continued on and they raised the money here. He was a pastor here for a number of years. One of the interesting stories he talks about in Proof of the Pudding was a Confederate soldier, which he was a Confederate soldier himself. He actually walked with a limp and a cane because he was injured in the Civil War. and he would be walking down Bank Street, and one of our ex-Confederate soldiers, probably our most decorated, was a guy named Colonel Horace King. Colonel Horace King was wounded twice at Gettysburg, fought in a number of different battles for a number of years with General James Longstreet. But when he came back to Decatur, he kind of had a rough time coping after the Civil War, became pretty much the town drunk, and would go through Bank Street, guns blazing, shooting up the town, raising all kind of cane. And he did not like John Harmon Nichols, and he would follow him up and down the street and curse him and so on. And finally, John Harmon Nichols had enough, confronted him. They had a fight on the middle of Bank Street, and John Harmon Nichols took his cane that he had and just beat poor Colonel Horace King into submission. After that, they became good friends. But other noted Methodist ministers, we had Dr. Anson West that was here. This church came to be built around 1898, I believe it was, and Dr. Anson West was one of the not only first pastors we had after it was rebuilt, but he also wrote a long history of the Methodists in Alabama, which is one of the books that the historians like to refer to when we talk about Methodist history here in Decatur. We're here at Stop 10 on our tour. This is the First Baptist Church. It's actually the third location of the 4 different locations that the First Baptist Church here in Decatur has had. One of the places we're going to go to is the first and the second location of where the churches were. But this church was built in 1908. The head of the building committee was someone I've talked about before, Samuel Sinclair Broadus, who lived right across the street. He helped with building the church. He also wrote a really neat history of First Baptist Church that we recently rediscovered that talks about the early church and some of the things that were going on. Samuel Sinclair Broadus was not only involved in this project, but if you've ever been to Horseshoe Bend National Park down south, he's responsible for that also. He went through and petitioned the state legislature to do something for the 100-year celebration of the Creek Indian War. He actually traveled to Oklahoma, brought back some Cherokee relatives of those Cherokee that had fought in the war. They had come and had a big celebration. The Cherokee actually came and stayed across the street here during that celebration on their way back to Oklahoma. There's a number of other associated people with the Baptist Church here. Josephus Shackelford was one of our early pastors that pastored here. A number of different people associated also. One of the pictures that we have in your handout is of Colonel Isaac Lane, who was one of our, well, he was our only Baptist founding father of Decatur of the 5 founding fathers. And what's neat about the picture we have of Colonel Isaac Lane, it's got a picture of his body servant Noah, his wife Polly Pride. It actually has a picture of the little dog. We know the name of the dog that they had back, and his also his horse that was here. What's neat about this portrait that we have here, Noah that you see here is his body servant. This is the only portrait I found of an African American slave prior to the Civil War. So we don't know everything about Noah, but we do know that after the Civil War he left, went down to Mobile, was a porter at one of the fancy hotels down in Mobile. We're across the street from First Baptist Church here at the home of Samuel Sinclair Broadus that we've talked about before. Again, Samuel Sinclair Broadus built this house around 1908, 1906, sometime around that time, and this is where he raised a number of his children. I like to talk about Samuel Sinclair Broadus, but I like to talk a lot about his children. One of them was Joe Broadus, his son, that became the vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. And they were good friends with David Rockefeller and the whole Rockefeller family. His sister, Mary Broadus, actually went to the University of Alabama, where she was good friends with Paul Bear Bryant. She was also Miss University of Alabama when she was down there, so she had that recognition. She came here after University of Alabama, taught for a while, got married, and then moved off to Connecticut. But the favorite daughter I like to talk about is Charlotte. Charlotte was a very beautiful young girl. She went to Judson to get her education. While she was there, she got engaged. And her fiance died tragically in an accident at Judson. And she was just heartbroken, and she used to tell people that she would never remarry again. She went on with her education up in North Carolina, then came back to Decatur where she was a second grade teacher. And this is one of the sad stories we have about poor Charlotte. Charlotte made a lot of women jealous here in Decatur. She was very beautiful. Because of her dad, she was very rich, and she was very single. And so as a second grade teacher, many of the parents started the rumor, which was not true, let me make that clear, that she was a nudist. Now, if you're back in the 1930s and your second grade teacher's a nudist, you've got problems. And so what they ended up doing was essentially getting Charlotte fired and ran her out of town. She went up north, lived close to her sister up in Connecticut for a while, but then at retirement age, she finally moved back to Decatur and lived in the McNeil Lyons Apartments that are here. But Charlotte's one of our, we've got some beautiful pictures of Charlotte. She was one of our most interesting, I guess, ladies that grew up here at the house. Here we are at Stop 12, the Carnegie Library that was built around 1904. I know you're probably tired of me talking about Samuel Sinclair Broadus, but he is the reason we have the Carnegie Library here. Again, when we talked about his dad, Dr. John A. Broadus, Dr. John A. Broadus was good friends with John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. He was good friends with J.P. Morgan, so they had that connection. So when it came time to get a library here in Decatur, then Samuel Sinclair Broadus was the best choice to go talk to Andrew Carnegie to get the library. Libraries before this one were kind of unique in that if you went to a library, you would ask the librarian for a book, and she would go get the book for you. This is a little different in that the books were set up in rows where you could actually browse through and pick out the book you wanted and then take it to the librarian. The first librarian we had was Virginia Neal, who married Thomas E. Pride. If you know the name Neely, her brother was one of the contributors to Vanderbilt University. There's a Neely Auditorium in Vanderbilt that named for him, that he was responsible on funding. But her and there was another lady named Louise Ledingham. If you know the story about the Ledingham sisters who were educators here in town, she was part of that family also. Well, we made a quick stop inside the Carnegie Library that's here. It is now the center of our art district that we have. When I say center, two of the homes we're going to go to that are next door were some of our, what I consider one of our famous artists. You've got Ned Frazier. There was a sculptor that lived next door. If you're familiar with Frazier Park, that's down next to the Dyken Park, that was named for him. And then the last stop, one of the last stops we're going to make is in front of the Nungester House, where we're going to talk a little more about Mildred Nungester, who I consider is one of our most famous artists that we had here in Decatur. We're next door to the Carnegie Library here. I mentioned this is the center of our art district. The reason I say that is because of the two homes that's behind us. Here to the right is the Ned Frazier home where Ned grew up. Ned was one of our sculptors that he had various different positions here in the city of Decatur, but sculpting was one of his hobbies. He did a sculpture of General Joe Wheeler that his family donated to the Decatur Public Library. We're still looking for that, still looking for the sculptor. We're not sure exactly what happened to it. Next door was the home of Cliff Nungester, and his two daughters, Frances and Mildred. Mildred, I say, was probably one of our most famous artists. She drew from a very young age. In fact, here on the sidewalk, she would used to do her paintings, and then when people would walk through her paintings that she had in chalk, oh, it just irritated her that that her chalk paintings were not being preserved. But she would go on to move to Jackson, Mississippi, studied at a number of famous art schools all across the country, was involved in art exhibitions up in Chicago and elsewhere. She became good friends with Eudora Welty. Some of you English majors may remember Eudora Welty of Jackson, Mississippi, who had famous novels and books that she wrote. When the National Portrait Gallery called Eudora to say she wanted a portrait of her to put in the museum, then her first choice was Mildred. And Mildred actually did the painting, submitted it. She painted her with a red coat that the Natural Portrait Gallery came back and said, you know, the red coat does not really fit the decor of the place it's going to be in. Can she redo it? And she was nice enough to say, yeah, she did it. And if you go to the National Portrait Gallery, just go see the portrait of Eudora Welty. The Homes right across the street was the location of the third or the second Baptist church that was built right after the Civil War, and before it was tore down or it was moved after the third one. But the next location and one of the last stops we're going to have is where the First Baptist Church was located here on Church Street. This is the first location for the First Baptist Church that was built here in 1838. It was a brick structure that was built. There were two families that were mainly involved in building the church. One of them was the Sykes family. We talked about the Sykes. James Turner Sykes, his brother George Sykes, donated the land for the property here to be built. The other one was the Burleson family, Dr. Aaron Burleson, who would be known for the Burleson McIntyre home here in town. His brother was one of our most famous preachers, Dr. Rufus Burleson, that came from Decatur. Dr. Rufus Burleson was the founder of Baylor University out in Texas and was also the one that baptized Sam Houston. When Sam Houston became a Baptist out in Texas, he said, there's only one person that's going to baptize me, and that's going to be Dr. Rufus Burleson, and that's what happened out in Texas. One of our most famous pastors that we had here was a guy named George Russell. Some of you may know the name George Russell. When I was growing up, the old Davy Crockett series that was on TV, you had Davy Crockett and his sidekick, Georgie Russell. Well, this is not the same George Russell. That was his father, Georgie Russell, that's buried over with his father, Major William Russell, over in Russellville, that Russellville is named for. But George Russell came here to Decatur and for a number of years was the pastor here at First Baptist Church before moving on to Mississippi and on to Texas. After the First Baptist Church here was tore down, then there was a man named Richard Humphreys who became pastor. And Richard Humphreys was in charge of raising money to build the next Baptist church here in Decatur. Unfortunately, he decided to take all the money and run off to Texas. He was married to Dr. Charles Price's daughter over from Priceville. You know the story about Dr. Charles Price, but he left his wife, left his kids, took the money, and went on to Texas. Not to say he didn't do good things when he got to Texas, because he did. But that's one of the stories about Reverend Richard Humphreys that we remember here in Decatur. Again, we don't really have a square here in Decatur, but I would call this the closest thing we have to a square is the park that we have here. We talked about a number of different churches. We didn't talk about the Episcopal Church. And if you remember when we were at the John D. Weicker hardware store, well, before that store was built, that was the location of the Episcopal Church. The first person to have a funeral there was one of our founding fathers, General Jesse Winston Garb. We also didn't talk about the Church of Christ. We also have a unique connection to the Church of Christ in that If you're familiar with its history, one of the founders, or so-called founders of the Church of Christ, was Alexander Campbell. His daughter Decima and her husband Judson Barclay would come to Decatur, lived here. They stayed in the Tavern Hotel, which was down on 6th Avenue. And he loved to go caving. In fact, he bought Toluca Cave. If you know where Toluca Cave is, over on the eastern part of the county. We're kind of getting to the end of one of our epidemics that we have here in Decatur. A lot of people always like to say it's never been this bad before, but I can name at least 3 to 4 different times when it was. One of the people I like to talk about was Oswald Cross Ludwig. The Ludwigs had a confectionery store here at the square. They also had the Ludwig Hotel and boarding house that they operated here. Frederick Ludwig came from Germany. He was here until 1878 when he died of the yellow fever epidemic. And we've had 2 yellow fever epidemics in 1878 and 1888. His son, Oswald Cross Ludwig, would go on to become the Secretary of State of Arkansas, published a number of different newspapers there, and then got a job at the U.S. Senate, where he was the main publisher for all the documents for the U.S. Senate. While he was in Washington, D.C., he contracted the Spanish flu, and they took him back to Little Rock. And right before he died in Little Rock of the Spanish flu, he said, of all the places I've been, the one place I want to be buried is back in Decatur, Alabama. And so after he died, they brought him back and put him in Decatur City Cemetery, where he's now located. Like I said, this is the 15th year that I've done these walking tours here in Decatur. We appreciate y'all joining us and going. Hopefully next year, one of the things I love about doing the walking tours is the banter between the people as we go and the questions. So hopefully next year we can get back on track and go through and have a walking tour. So thanks for joining us, and on behalf of the Martin County Historical Society, we appreciate it.